Hey guys, tonight we wander back to ancient Greece. Not the part with epic wars or monster-slaying heroes, but something far sleepier. Imagine golden fields, lazy cows chewing slowly under fig trees and one very bored god covered in hay. Because tonight, you're following Apollo, the glittery golden boy of Mount Olympus, as he serves a cosmic punishment in the form of a day job. Yes, Apollo, god of the sun, gets fired from his heavenly duties and ends up herding cows. You probably won't survive this story. Not from danger, just from the sheer soul-level boredom Apollo endures. But hey, it's that special kind of boredom that gets the imagination yawning and the eyelids drooping. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to drop your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where you all are nodding off around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in the middle of Olympus. Well, wake might be generous. You blink, yawn, and find yourself halfway between a harp lesson and yet another divine banquet, watching a golden chariot drift by like it forgot what urgency was. The place is all clouds and marbled smugness. Gods reclining, sipping nectar, arguing about who invented olives. Again, and then crash. A lyre gets hurled off a balcony, followed by Apollo. Yes, the Apollo. He's in one of his moods again. Apparently someone insulted his poetry again, and instead of letting it go like a grown immortal, he challenged 3 nymphs and a satyr to a musical duel, declared himself winner, then got deeply offended when the crowd voted for the satyr with panpipes. Classic. Now he's being marched, well dramatically escorted, into Zeus's throne room for punishment. Again, Zeus, who's basically the universe's overworked principal at this point, doesn't even blink. He just sighs and says 3 years, on Earth, with a job. Apollo gasps. You almost hear his golden hair deflate. A job, a mortal one, the horror. But Zeus is done with the godly drama. This isn't even Apollo's first offense. Just last year, he vaporized a theater critic for calling his hymn a bit pitchy. So with a thunderous clap, and probably a few eye rolls from Hera, Apollo is sent down. Not to rule, not to charm, but to work. His destination, Thessaly, not exactly known for glamour, just fields dust and some of the sleepiest cows in the Mediterranean. You land with a squish. Apollo faceplants into a wheat field, robes askew, lyre dented. The cows blink at him in polite confusion. A goat chews on one of his sandals. And just like that, the glittering god of sunlight is now a confused, mud-smeared intern on a cattle farm. You trudge behind him as he makes his way toward a nearby estate. It's early morning, the dew still clings to the grass, and his every footstep is a complaint. He finally arrives at the small palace of Admetus, a mortal prince, known for his hospitality, honesty, and general soft-spoken charm. If this were a sitcom, Admetus would be the cinnamon roll who everyone protects, including, as you'll soon find out, Apollo himself. Admetus answers the door in linen robes, hair tousled, a little sleepy, but weirdly cheerful. He sees Apollo golden and grouchy, and without hesitation says, "Oh, are you the new cowhand?" Apollo blinks. "I'm a god." Admetus shrugs. "Cool, the cows are over there?" No thunder, no awe, just directions. You might expect Apollo to bristle, declare war, maybe curse the cows into centaurs or something, but instead he sighs and walks toward the pasture. It's like he knows he deserves this. One divine tantrum too many, and here he is, tasked with the most unglamorous labor possible, feeding, brushing, and counting creatures who mostly chew grass and stare at nothing. The first morning is chaos. Apollo has no idea what he's doing. He tries to command the cows like a chorus line up. He shouts, "Move in harmony." They wander in opposite directions. He tries to shine sunlight dramatically at them. One cow squints, moos, and poops. Eventually, Admetus shows him how to hold a rake. Apollo glares at it like it's a cursed artifact. "I don't." "Rake," he murmurs. "You do now," Admetus replies cheerfully, tossing him a bucket. Historical records mention Apollo's punishment in myth, but the details vary. Some say he served for a year, others say several. Scholars still argue whether this phase was metaphorical, a cleansing of divine pride, or literal divine community service. Either way, the sun god spends the next several months elbow-deep in mud. He wakes up before sunrise. He brushes cows named Olive Myrtle and Clydos. He milks goats. He develops a very real vendetta against a rooster named Gregor, who crows directly into his ear every single dawn. But something begins to shift. He stops complaining out loud. He starts humming. Not for anyone, just for himself. And one afternoon, when the wind is quiet and the fields glow gold in the light, he's no longer allowed to control. He carves a piece of olive wood into the shape of a lyre. He plucks the strings as cows wander past unbothered. And for the first time in ages, he doesn't think about Olympus. He just plays. A god in exile, a prince unaware, a herd of cows with questionable bladder control, and a story so small it almost doesn't survive into the modern world. But it does, because even the most boring job in mythology has a lesson stitched into its muddy, moo-filled folds. You wake up the next day, if you ever really slept, with the gentle hum of cows, lowing in the background, and the uncomfortable realization that yes, Apollo is still here, still exiled, and still very much not over it. He's sprawled under a fig tree, arms crossed, squinting at a particularly stubborn patch of cow drool on his once shimmering robe. His divine glow dull, his mood sour yogurt. And all of this traces back to the one being who can undo it, Zeus, king of the gods, father of far too many. Demigod, serial lightning enthusiast, and more importantly, for this story enforcer of cosmic consequences. You float backward in time just a little to see how this all started. Because as usual, it wasn't just Apollo being bored. No, this time it involved a temple, a poorly timed plague, and of course a murder. According to myth, Apollo's beloved son, Asclepius, the future god of medicine, by the way, had gotten too good at healing, like raising the dead good, which, if you're wondering, is a huge no-no in divine circles. Hades, god of the underworld, and not a fan of lost customers, complained to Zeus. Zeus, like a tired manager in a mythical HR department, responded with his signature move, a thunderbolt. Zap, Asclepius gone. Apollo understandably did not take this well. He did what any grief-stricken, overly dramatic sun god might do. He marched straight to Delphi and slaughtered the Cyclopes, who had forged Zeus's lightning bolts in the first place. Yeah, not subtle, and that's when Zeus really cracked down. 3 years, mortality, labor, he declared. Probably while rubbing his temples. Pick a human, get a job, learn something. This wasn't the first time Zeus had used the mortal world as a divine timeout corner. Historians still argue whether these mortal punishments served as symbolic lessons in humility, or were just a cosmic version of go think about what you've done. In Apollo's case, it was definitely the latter. So back in Thessaly with the sun nowhere near under his command, Apollo has no choice but to comply. You watch him that morning as he trudges behind Admetus, tall regal, and still carrying a little divine smugness under all that hay. Admetus explains the cow schedule with cheerful simplicity. Feed them, brush them, keep them from wandering into the wine cellar. Apollo responds with a majestic blank stare. Also, don't let Olive eat the olives, Admetus adds. She has no self-control. The cow named Olive moose guiltily from behind a tree. Now a few notes about Admetus your mortal in this weird little buddy comedy. He's a king, sure, but more of the rites poetry. And gives good hugs type than the rides into battle with flaming swords type. His palace is modest, his servants like him. And his main vice seems to be adopting strays, including now, apparently, disgraced gods. The relationship between Apollo and Admetus is one of those delightfully ambiguous ones from myth. Some say it was purely employer-employee. Others whisper that Apollo fell in love. Ancient texts hint at tenderness Apollo, giving him divine gifts, protecting his home, even extending his lifespan. Historians still argue whether it was romantic platonic or just unusually codependent for a deity-mortal dynamic. But here's what you do see respect. Apollo doesn't try to smite Admetus. He listens, grumbles sure, but listens. And Admetus doesn't worship him. He hands him a pitchfork and says, "You missed a spot." Day by day the routine settles in. Apollo feeds the herd. He learns the names of each cow, except that one he insists on calling Beast of Tartarus, after she kicks him in the shin every morning. He accidentally burns the first haystack he touches, then builds a new one better balanced with an artist's precision. Admetus watches amused. You know he says one evening sipping watered-down wine, "You're not terrible at this." Apollo raises an eyebrow. "I am a radiant god." Admetus shrugs, radiantly covered in cow spit. The cows moo in agreement. Some days are smooth, others are disasters. One time a rogue goat, not Gregor, a different one, breaks into the pantry and eats an entire bag of fermented grain. The resulting chaos involves 4 overturned carts, 2 broken looms, and a confused Apollo being chased by what he calls a drunken demon in fur. But the weirdest thing is he's coping. He starts to rise earlier, he hums while working, and at night he sits on the roof watching the stars his old coworkers twinkle from afar. One evening, a shooting star arcs across the sky. Apollo watches it and whispers, "Show off." You wonder if he misses Olympus. He doesn't say it. But the way he pauses mid-lyre chord when the clouds roll by, that says enough. He's still divine, but he's adapting, even if he still tries to glamorize it, like the day he decides to name every cow after a constellation and insists they walk in zodiac formation. Spoiler, they do not. Olive walks directly into a beehive. Apollo gets stung. He spends the afternoon sulking under a fig tree, composing a mournful ballad titled Ode to Itchy Betrayal. Meanwhile, Admetus just hands him some herbal balm and says, "You'll live." And he does. In fact, for someone stripped of cosmic power, he's doing remarkably well. You see it in the way he starts caring about the cattle's routine, the way he knows which ones like being brushed behind the ears, the way he actually tries the local food hesitantly at first, then with a little smile. There's a particular moment that stays with you. Late one night, as the moon hangs low, Apollo sits by the pasture playing his lyre. The cows are all lying down, even Gregor is asleep, and there's peace. Not triumph, not glory. Just a god in exile plucking lullabies for creatures too simple to care who he used to be. It's quiet, so quiet you almost fall asleep yourself, but not yet. There's still plenty of manure to go around. You wake to the scent of fig bread and something vaguely singed. Not fire, not brimstone, more like an overcooked ambition. Apollo is in the courtyard, sleeves rolled up, nose wrinkled, and very much not enjoying the task of mucking out stalls. You spot him dramatically wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief he almost certainly conjured from thin air. Nearby, Admetus is laughing into his cup, and it hits you this isn't punishment anymore. This is weirdly domestic, but don't get too cozy. Because if there's one thing Greek myths love more than drama, it's what happens next, the divine overachieving phase. Apollo has officially entered his let me secretly improve everything era. See, even stripped of his power, he's still Apollo, still clever, still vain. Still convinced that a place with handmade cowbells and uneven pasture rows is a personal offense. So he begins tweaking. It starts small. He reorganizes the tool shed for aesthetic balance. He weaves gold thread into the stable doors to improve morale. Then one morning, you find him in the middle of the field, surrounded by dozens of confused cows, and a full orchestral setup of panpipes, drums, and lyres, all charmed to play harmonies when the cows walk between them. He calls it the Pastoral Symphony of Moo. Admetus calls it unsettling. The cows nonplussed. Still Apollo insists the milk tastes better when the cows are serenaded. And honestly, you sip some and it's surprisingly creamy. Coincidence, probably. But try telling that to a god with a bruised ego and a flute. One scroll fragment from antiquity mentions that during his servitude, Phoebus made the fields of Thessaly flourish beyond mortal measure. Crops bloomed faster. Rain came exactly when needed. Milk overflowed. Historians still argue whether this was divine magic sneaking through the punishment barrier or just Apollo applying himself for the first time in eons. Either way, the estate thrives. Olive the cow grows plump. The chickens lay double. Even Gregor, the problematic rooster, starts crowing in key. Admetus is impressed. "You really care," he says one evening as they sip wine under an olive tree. Apollo snorts. "I care about not being terrible at things." But you can tell he does care. Maybe not about the cows, okay? Maybe a little about Olive, but about the rhythm of things. About a place where no one expects him to be dazzling or divine, just decent. And in this newfound rhythm, something delicate blooms. Let's pause for a second on the relationship between Apollo and Admetus. Ancient Greek sources are vague. Some say they were lovers, others say companions. Some frame it as a spiritual bond, others as a story of a god humbled by mortal kindness. Historians still argue whether this tale was intended as a divine romance, a friendship parable, or an allegory about power and grace. But here's what you see. They laugh. They argue softly. They share figs and stories under starlight. Apollo teaches Admetus the constellations. Admetus teaches Apollo how to fix a broken wheel using actual effort. And slowly the god stops looking at the sky so much. Instead, he looks at Admetus. It's awkward at first. Apollo stumbles over mortal feelings the way he once tripped over a cow trough. But Admetus is patient. He doesn't ask for Olympus. He doesn't bow. He just hands Apollo a fig and says, "You're better when you're not trying to impress anyone." And Apollo for once doesn't argue. You watch this little dynamic evolve like a sleepy sitcom, grumpy, immortal, cheerful farmer prince, and a barn full of emotional, support livestock. There's even a running gag. Every time Apollo tries to improve something with divine flair, it backfires. He blesses the wine to make it more flavorful. Everyone gets hiccups for 2 days straight. He enchants the plow to move itself. It crashes into the kitchen. He builds a miniature sun orb to keep the goats warm at night. It melts all the cheese. Eventually, he learns moderation, a foreign concept for gods, but one Thessaly enforces with impressive consistency. And the villagers, At first, they think the new farmhand is just another cousin of Admetus, a little weird but very pretty. Soon they start coming by more often, asking for songs, for stories, for blessings. Not because they fear him, because they like him. A woman with a limp offers him olives. A boy with missing teeth asks for a lullaby. A grandmother hands him a knitted scarf that is for some reason 10 feet long. Apollo accepts them all, even the scarf. He wears it once, just once. He trips over it in the mud and declares it cursed, but he keeps it anyway. And as the seasons shift, spring curling towards summer, you begin to notice how Apollo shifts too. Less scowling, more humming. Less sulking, more tending. He learns to fix harnesses, to sharpen plows, to catch a calf mid-birth without summoning a thundercloud. He even names a chicken. He calls it Calliope. It lays exactly 1 egg a week, always on Tuesdays. Apollo insists it's an omen. Admetus calls it breakfast. But no myth, no matter how sleepy, stays peaceful forever. And just as Apollo begins to forget that he's counting the days, a visitor arrives. He comes at dusk, a tall man in dark robes, eyes hidden beneath a hood, carrying the scent of smoke and stillness. Apollo stiffens. You recognize him before anyone speaks. Hermes, messenger of the gods, delivery boy of Olympus, collector of secrets, bringer of terms. He greets Admetus politely, then turns to Apollo. Time's up. You don't breathe. Not that you need to, but if you did, this is where you'd hold it. Apollo stands in the golden twilight, that ever so slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, betraying more than he wants to admit. The cows are silent, even Olive, who usually makes a whole show of dinner time. Hermes just stands there, calm, unreadable sandals barely touching the earth. You half expect him to pull out a scroll, some formal declaration, signed in Zeus's chicken-scratch thunderbolt handwriting, but no, just 5 words. Time to come back, Phoebus. Not Apollo, not the sun, not you, radiant and ever-glorious son of Leto. Just Phoebus, the bright one. And oh, the irony. Because right now he looks less like light incarnate and more like a slightly muddy shepherd who hasn't trimmed his hair in weeks. Admetus steps forward, confusion folding across his features. Come back to Olympus. Hermes nods. Zeus has lifted the sentence, and here it is, the divine dilemma. Go back to the clouds, to golden halls and eternal worship, or stay with cows and fig jam and someone who sees you. Apollo, of course, doesn't answer immediately. He's not that dramatic. Oh wait, he totally is. He brushes past Hermes and walks straight to the stables. You follow. Inside it smells of straw and cedar. Familiar now, comforting. Apollo leans against a post, arms crossed, gaze, drifting toward the little cracked window where moonlight filters in. Wasn't expecting this, he mutters. Thought I had more time. You do the math. It's been 3 years. Exactly. Time moves slippery in myth, but this detail has stuck. Zeus doesn't do grace periods. Admetus joins him quiet. You don't have to decide tonight. But Apollo knows that's a lie. Hermes doesn't do sleepovers. There's a pause. You could stay. Admetus offers his voice low, hopeful. Here, with me, us. And for the first time you realize what this has become. Not exile, not punishment, but home. Still Apollo is a god, and gods do not belong. He leaves the stable that night without a word, and in the morning he's gone. You half expect a goodbye note. Maybe something grandiose, etched in celestial runes across the barn wall. But all he leaves behind is a single gold lyre string, curled delicately around Calliope the chicken's leg. She pecks at it once and goes back to sleep. So what now? The cows continue to moo. Admetus continues to rule. Gregor still wakes up 2 hours too early and shrieks like a harbinger of doom. But the warmth is thinner, the morning's quieter, and then the whisper begins. The first time you hear it, it's a shepherd's wife at the market whispering to her neighbor. They say the fields grow brighter now, that the wheat sings. Then a girl claims the fountain water glows at dawn. Then a goat refuses to eat, unless sung to "Don't look at Gregor like that." It wasn't him this time. You feel it too. Not much, just a shimmer, like the edges of the world have been buffed. Turns out Apollo didn't leave empty-handed. He took the lessons and left behind a touch of divinity in return. And far, far above, beyond the clouds, and past the trembling edge of the sky, you spot him. Apollo, cloaked in radiance once more, sitting beside the sun chariot staring down at Thessaly, like someone watching the life they once tried to escape become something too dear to forget. Historians still argue whether Apollo returned to Olympus changed, whether he ruled the sun with more gentleness after Admetus, whether he ever really forgave Zeus. But you know this, he remembered. Every field, every song, every mistake. He carried it. One summer later, Admetus receives a gift. No explanation, just a box made of laurel wood sealed with divine wax. Inside, a lyre string, another one, and a scroll. Not a decree, not a warning, just a lullaby in Apollo's handwriting. The title reads, "For the one who knew my name before my light." Admetus weeps, not because he's sad, because the world rarely gives us perfect circles. And this one came close. You drift now through time again, watching the world turn, watching myths shift. And centuries later, in dusty scrolls and fragmented texts, you still find echoes of the story. One poet in Hellenistic Alexandria writes of a god who herded cows and found humility. A Roman philosopher muses on the irony of divine punishment teaching grace. Even Renaissance painters take a swing at the story. One fresco shows Apollo in a peasant tunic, hair messy, a cow nuzzling his arm while the sun rises behind him. No one gets it entirely right. But maybe that's the point. Myths aren't about precision. They're about truthiness. And the truth. Sometimes even gods need a break from being gods. Sometimes the only way back to the heavens is through a really, really boring cow job. And now back in the pasture, the cows return to their grazing. The sun shines a little warmer, and the lyre plays somewhere quietly, softly, a melody just for them. You sit now in the long shadow of Olympus, where thunderheads swirl like gossip, and the air smells faintly of ego and pine. Apollo's back. But back doesn't mean normal. He rides the chariot, yes. The sun still rises golden and predictable thanks to him. But there's something different about the way he pulls the reins. Less flourish, more focus. Less look at me, more. Let's get this over with so I can tune my lyre in peace. Even the horses notice. One of them, Pyroes, starts refusing to bolt forward, until Apollo hums a Thessalian lullaby under his breath, which, if you ask me, is solid emotional growth for everyone involved. The other gods, oh, they notice too. Dionysus squints and mutters something about pastoral vibes. Athena raises an eyebrow but says nothing because she's Athena and already knows everything. Even Zeus watches from his golden throne, fist poised above a lightning bolt, like he's considering a round of divine micromanagement. But then lowers it, because for once, Apollo isn't being a problem. He's just quiet. And when a god gets quiet, Olympus pays attention. Still, old habits die harder than immortality. Soon enough, Apollo is roped back into divine business. Prophecies, plagues, ceremonial harp solos, that sort of thing. One day, a mortal prince tries to steal fire and ends up mildly crispy. The next, some oracle in Delphi gets struck by poetic inspiration and can't stop rhyming. She blames Apollo, he blames Mercury retrograde. And then there's the temple, Delphi the jewel in his mythic crown. Priestesses draped in mist-sacred laurel leaves cryptic messages that make fortune cookies look straightforward. You'd think this would make Apollo feel at home, but instead he walks the halls like someone inspecting a museum version of himself. The statues are too shiny, the prayers too loud. The prophecies, well, they feel hollow. Not wrong, just detached, as if everyone's performing reverence rather than feeling it. You catch him staring at a fresco of himself, battling the python, the great serpent of Delphi, and muttering, "Was I always this glowy?" And there it is again, that flicker of doubt, of distance. It's as if Apollo's begun measuring everything by a new standard. Not power, not beauty, but authenticity. Back on Earth, Admetus gets married. Yes, married. It's arranged, political, expected. The bride Alcestis is kind and clever, and totally not threatened by the fact her husband once harbored a literal sun god. The wedding is simple by royal standards. You watch from a fig tree, invisible and curious. Admetus smiles, though it doesn't quite reach his eyes. And then during the feast, someone plucks a lyre string. Not a harpist, not the band. Just one single golden note rising from nowhere, resonating through the olive grove. Everyone hears it. No one sees who played it. Admetus closes his eyes for a moment, then continues pouring wine. Apollo's not there. Not physically, but something of him lingers like the echo of sunlight on winter stone. Historians still argue whether Apollo ever truly returned to Thessaly, whether he ever saw Admetus again, whether gods can visit mortals twice without consequence. But you know this sometimes presence doesn't require proximity. And this story, it isn't over. Meanwhile, back in Delphi, Apollo makes an odd request. He orders his high priestess to redesign part of the temple courtyard. Less marble, he says, more garden. The priestess blinks. You want plants? He nods, preferably things goats won't eat. And so the courtyard blooms. Lavender, sage, even a fig tree or two. Visitors start noticing the change. They leave offerings not of gold, but of bread. Handmade, warm, wrapped in cloth. One child leaves a wooden carving of a cow. The priestess tries to remove it. Apollo stops her. She stays, he says. Her name is Olive. It becomes a shrine within the shrine. Quiet, earthy, unimpressive unless you understand what it means. And over time, Delphi changes too. Less pomp, more heart. More questions like, how do I grow patience? And fewer like, when will I win the war? Apollo answers them all, sometimes with riddles, sometimes with silence, but always, always with a memory of cows' fig trees, and the man who once handed him a rope and said, try not to let this one escape again. One particularly foggy morning, a traveling bard arrives at Delphi. She sings of a god who fell to earth and learned how to love without lightning. Her voice wobbles. She's nervous, but Apollo listens, all the way to the end. Then he offers her a fig, not divine, just from the garden, and tells her you sang it true. The story spreads. Not the one about Apollo slaying monsters or burning mortals with sunlight. The other one, the boring one, the cow one. And that somehow is the one people keep telling. Because it's quiet and honest and a little bit funny. And because somewhere in all of us, even the loudest of gods, there's a secret longing to be ordinary. So now you drift again, not forward, not back, but sideways through stories that rarely make it into school curriculums or marble statues. Because when a god changes, the world shifts in ways too subtle for thunderbolts. You find yourself in a village nestled somewhere between the folds of Thessaly, Delphi, and Dream. One of those places too small for a name, but big enough for stories. They tell them in whispers around the hearth, and one in particular keeps coming up. It starts with, "There was a time the sun herded cows." You settle on a rooftop as a child recounts it to her younger brother. Her voice hushed conspiratorial. He wasn't even good at it. He didn't know which end of the cow the hay goes in. The brother giggles, but there's something reverent about it too. Like the tale isn't just a joke, but a treasure. A reminder that even immortals can flail. And maybe that's the entire appeal. Because the gods, they're always so much. Too shiny, too dramatic, too perfect, or too punishing. But this story, it's different. Here the god doesn't win a war or curse a kingdom. He just tries not to lose a goat named Gregor. The villagers start leaving little offerings near the pastures. Not for Demeter, not for Pan, for Apollo of the field. Bread, milk, songs hummed into the dusk, and sometimes, just sometimes, a sunrise feels especially warm, like it remembers your name. Back in Delphi, the garden flourishes. Apollo's lyre, usually hung in his hall, like a museum relic, ends up resting more often on a mossy stone beneath the fig trees. He plays for no audience, except perhaps the ants and the occasional bird, bold enough to hop close. There's peace in this, but gods are restless creatures, especially ones who've tasted less. So one day, Apollo decides to visit someone he hasn't seen since long before Thessaly, Aesculapius. His son, well, technically a demigod born from an awkward situation involving a mortal woman, a C-section by lightning, and a goat who accidentally witnessed the whole thing, but details. You trail behind him invisible again, though somehow he knows you're there. He always knows. Aesculapius is now famous in his own right. The god of medicine, the snake-entwined staff guy, the reason hospitals look the way they do. Which is ironic considering he once got in trouble for resurrecting the dead without divine permission. But we're not here for legal briefs. Apollo approaches him at dusk when the clinics are quieter and the prayers have dimmed to murmurs. "You still mad at me?" he asks. Aesculapius raises an eyebrow. "For smuggling me out of my dead mother's womb and turning me into a walking Hippocratic oath." Apollo shrugs. "You're welcome." They talk like that for a while, deflective teasing skimming over the real stuff. But eventually it lands. "I've been thinking," Apollo says, "about what it means to be useful." Aesculapius leans back against a column. "You already drive the sun. Isn't that enough?" "Not really," Apollo says. "Turns out I like cows." This gets a smile and a long silence. Then Apollo says something no god has ever admitted in a voice that sounds like dusk settling over warm grass. "I miss being boring." There it is. The core. Not power, not adoration, just presence. Historians still argue whether Apollo ever walked among mortals again after Delphi, whether this visit with his son was real or merely poetic metaphor, passed down through philosophers who wanted to humanize the divine. But again, you know better, because boring isn't a failure. It's a gift. Back in Olympus, things continue in the usual dramatic fashion. Ares starts a war over a spilled goblet. Hera tries rebranding family loyalty with a new PR scroll. Poseidon files yet another complaint about not having enough altars inland. You meanwhile curl beside the fig tree in Delphi and listen as Apollo teaches a young acolyte how to listen to silence. Not read signs, not chase omens, just sit and listen. The acolyte is confused. Is this prophecy? Apollo smiles. It's peace. Soon others follow. Poets, yes, but also midwives, farmers, exhausted travelers who aren't looking for answers so much as rest, and Apollo gives them that. Not fire, not plague, not divine vengeance, just a break. a place where the god who once outran his own legend finally learned how to sit still long enough to watch a chicken fall asleep in his lap. You remember her, right? Calliope, still alive somehow, still judging, still laying eggs like it's a competitive sport. Apollo feeds her figs, she tolerates him. It's a love story, really. And speaking of love stories, back in Thessaly Admetus ages, not fast, but visibly. Mortals do that. He rules wisely, listens more than he speaks, hangs Apollo's second lyre string above the hearth like a blessing and a dare. One night, he stares into the fire and whispers something too soft to catch. But if you had to guess, it's thank you. Not for the light, for the quiet, for the chance to see the world through eyes that weren't trying to dazzle anyone. And as the embers crackle, a warm breeze slips through the window. You know who sent it? The sun rises the next morning, not with a bang or a blaze, but with a gentle glow that kisses the hills awake. And Apollo, he's still up there, still driving the chariot. But somewhere inside him, a part is always in Thessaly, watching Gregor panic about squirrels. You now find yourself somewhere between myth and memory, where time folds like laundry and stories cling together like mismatched socks. The seasons drift, and with them the tales. Delphi grows quieter, its gardens thicker with sage and stillness. Apollo hums more than he speaks these days. His music, once flamboyant and blinding like an operatic light show, is now softer. The kind that lingers in the corners of a courtyard behind the rustle of fig leaves or the slow drip of water from a marble fountain. And it's here, right under a blooming myrtle, that something unexpected begins to sprout. A philosophy, not the big flashy kind like Socrates, spouting existential riddles while getting sentenced to death, but the gentle kind that seeps into habits and hand gestures, a way of living that values what doesn't scream for attention. Acolytes start writing it down, not in stone but on linen scrolls. Moderation of magnificence, one scroll reads. Peace through presence, says another. Apollo doesn't name it, but the people do. They call it lethephoria, the carrying of gentle forgetting. Because in this temple you don't come to discover your destiny. You come to lay it down for a while, and maybe nap. One elderly shepherd says, it's the only shrine where I come out feeling less worried than when I went in. A high compliment, honestly. Now remember Hermes, messenger of the gods, professional trickster, inventor of flip-flops. He swings by Delphi one afternoon, half out of boredom, half out of curiosity. He finds Apollo sipping warm goat's milk and watching ants dismantle a breadcrumb. Did you hit your head? Hermes asks. Apollo blinks. No, just stopped running. Hermes tilts his head. You're Apollo. Stopping isn't really your brand. Apollo shrugs. Maybe it should be. There's a pause. Then Hermes, king of chaos, kicks off his sandals and sits beside him. Just like that, they watch the ants in companionable silence for nearly an hour before Hermes says, okay, this is either genius or terrifying. Historians still argue whether this encounter sparked a minor cult in Athens, where followers wore mismatched sandals and refused to answer direct questions. Personally, you hope so. Word of Delphi's shift travels as word always does when it's unexpected. No burning bushes, no booming clouds, just a slow trickle of pilgrims coming not to be dazzled, but to be left alone for a bit. Artists start sketching the quiet Apollo, always barefoot, always mid-thought, always near chickens. And somewhere between the hymns and the hammock naps, a new rumor begins. That the god who once loved with the intensity of wildfires now loves gently, which honestly might be more radical than anything he's done before. Of course not. Everyone's thrilled. In Corinth, a priest publicly asks, has Apollo gone soft? In Sparta, a general demands a return to classic sun god energy. Even Zeus sends a passive-aggressive storm cloud in the shape of a thunderbolt emoji. But Apollo, he just trims his fig tree. Let them complain. He's finally good at something that doesn't involve pyrotechnics or plague. Still, change has a ripple effect. One morning, a minor forest deity arrives in Delphi. She's covered in pine sap and speaks entirely in squirrel metaphors. She presents a complaint: the nearby rivers are forgetting to flood. Apollo listens, then gently asks if that's maybe a good thing. The nymph huffs, "It's not natural." He nods, "Neither are marble statues, but here we are." They sit. Eventually, she agrees to let the rivers choose their own pace, and she stays for lunch. Delphi's new reputation grows stranger by the week. It becomes the only place in Greece where nothing has to happen, where even gods can call in emotionally absent for the day, and mortals, they lean into it. There's a man who comes every week just to lie on the temple steps and listen to birds until he forgets his own birthday. Another brings his mother, who's convinced the columns whisper cooking advice. No one corrects her, because maybe they do. And still, Apollo tends the garden. One day he finds an old lyre half buried beneath the sage. The strings are broken, the frame warped. But he doesn't toss it. He repairs it slowly, not to perform, just to remember. He plucks one note, then another, and something shifts. Not in the sky, in you. You start to wonder if maybe, just maybe, you've been running too hard too long. If there's a part of you that's been quietly begging for a fig tree, a patch of dirt, a badly tuned lyre with a history. And that's when it happens. Apollo catches your eye. No words, just a knowing smile. You wonder if he sees you. He does. Of course he does. You, the quiet traveler, in this myth of soft turns and slow light. You who came for gods and stayed for the goats. And you realize something important. This is the story. Not the monsters, not the lightning. This, the warmth of sunlight filtered through vines. The way boredom can become beauty when no one's watching. The way even a god can be fired and still find his way back, not to Olympus, but to himself. You wake metaphorically, at least beside a gently cracked amphora, its mouth blooming with time. The cicadas are half asleep. Even the wind seems to move more slowly here. Delphi hums with the sound of a place that knows better than to rush. And you're starting to understand the appeal. Apollo isn't at the temple today. He's not on the sun chariot either. No scandal, no divine emergency, just a day off. Instead, you spot him beneath an olive tree surrounded by scrolls, and what looks suspiciously like a pile of goat-themed poetry written by his most recent acolyte. He looks both amused and slightly horrified. Her bleat is a hymn of rustic love. He reads aloud with a sigh. This one rhymes you with you. You catch the grin hiding behind his irritation. Being adored is exhausting, being goofily misinterpreted weirdly comforting. And anyway, Calliope the chicken sits proudly nearby as if she ghost wrote the whole scroll. This somehow counts as divine inspiration now. Elsewhere, temple visitors are adapting. Instead of rituals, they bring questions like, how do I quiet my brain? What if I don't want to be great? Is it okay to just be? Apollo answers with things like, let's have a plum, or sit by the moss for a bit, or his personal favorite, do less. That's the miracle. There's a particular moment, one you won't forget, when a war veteran kneels at the altar and asks why the gods didn't save his brothers. Apollo doesn't reply with thunder or truth. He kneels beside the man and says nothing. Historians still argue whether Delphi ever truly shifted from prophecy to presence, whether Apollo consciously evolved, or whether the stories just softened over time to make him feel more human. But you were there. You felt it. the moment the god with the golden bow laid it down and chose stillness over spectacle. Now here's where things take a delightfully odd turn. A group of philosophy students from Athens decides to investigate Delphi's spiritual decline, expecting faded marble and confused chickens. What they find instead is a temple blooming with herbs goats, with names like Euripides, and a line of people waiting just to sit in the shade. One student writes in his journal, "Day 3, haven't spoken, still feel seen." Another sculpts a statue of Apollo, reclining in sandals holding a fig. It causes a minor scandal back home, but later becomes a best-selling incense holder. You can't make this stuff up. Well, technically you can, but in this case the weirdness feels earned. And speaking of weirdness, a traveling bard arrives from the islands hoping to impress Apollo with a new epic. It's about sea monsters' betrayal and an overly complicated love triangle between a naiad, a bronze automaton, and a sentient ship's sail. It's a lot. Apollo listens, nods, then gently says, "What if you wrote something smaller?" The bard blinks, like, "What?" "Write about your mother's kitchen," Apollo says. "Write about the way honey stuck to the spoon." And so he does, and it's beautiful, because sometimes shrinking the frame makes the picture clearer. That's become the unspoken motto of Delphi now. Shrink the frame, light the lamp, take your time. You trail through the town, now dotted with olive stalls and humble bakeries. The temple economy, formerly centered on grand rituals, is now propped up by goat cheese and handmade sandals. There's a stall where someone sells official Apollo. Was boring, and that's okay tunics. You buy one. It's extremely soft. Even Artemis visits. You hear her before you see her. Those sure-footed strides, the sharp crack of a bow against her back. She stands in the shade, arms crossed, watching her brother meditate with a chicken. She raises an eyebrow. He says nothing. She rolls her eyes. "You're still weird." Then she sits beside him. Because siblings may mock each other relentlessly, but they always show up for the soft parts too. She even brings him a new quiver, less for battle and more for holding snacks. It's lined with figs and almond cakes. Apollo grins. You get the sense this is his version of heaven now. No throne, no choir, just a place where nothing explodes. Of course, Zeus still sends notes. "We have a thunder quota," he grumbles. "You're not contributing." Apollo writes back, contributing to quiet. "You're welcome." Dionysus, meanwhile, sends wine. He gets it. There's something inherently rebellious about not performing, not needing applause, letting your myth fade a little around the edges. And somewhere, maybe, even in the heart of a tired listener like you, a question stirs. What would it look like to not chase greatness? To let the days be small and kind? To enjoy the sun without trying to own it? That's Delphi now. Not a place of spectacle, a sanctuary of slowing down. And Apollo, he's not retired. He's refined. No less powerful, just less loud. You lean back against the temple stones. You let the sun warm your skin, not scorch it, just hold it. And maybe if you close your eyes and listen, you'll hear him playing that old lyre, quietly enough that you feel it more than hear it. And that might be the most sacred thing of all. Somewhere around the 3rd week of being unofficially permanent at Delphi, you stop expecting divine drama and start appreciating the smell of fresh olive bread drifting from the temple kitchens. Yes, kitchens. The oracle insisted that enlightenment is easier to come by when you're not hangry. You agree. Apollo now hosts something loosely resembling quiet hours every afternoon. No divine revelations, no rituals, just stillness. Chickens cluck gently in the background, scrolls get recopied with too much ink, and one acolyte plays the panpipes very badly from behind a bush. Apollo pretends not to notice. but he's listening. The god who once demanded flawless hymnals now smiles at off-key lullabies and poems that rhyme love with dove unironically. There's a softness in him, like he's realizing maybe the whole point of being divine wasn't about being the best, it was about being at all. The temple starts attracting a very specific type of visitor. Burned-out scribes, disillusioned philosophers, mid-level officials with existential dread and low back pain. And then there's you who maybe came for a myth but stayed for the vibe. You who once believed Olympus was the height of everything sacred, now deeply invested in whether the temple cats have formed a friendship with the temple goats. They nap together, you weep. And it's during one of these slow afternoons that an unexpected guest arrives, a muse. Not one of the famous 9, no, this one's local, freelance probably. Hair full of straw sandals, mismatched eyes sharp. She watches Apollo from a distance and then says, "You're different." Apollo nods. Is that a compliment? She shrugs. It's a shift. Shifts are rarely comfortable. She wanders off after that, leaving behind a feather and half a pomegranate. He tucks the feather into his belt and keeps the pomegranate for later. Historians still argue whether this period marks the first divine midlife crisis or the dawn of theological minimalism. Either way, Apollo doesn't care. He's planting rosemary and humming. Sometimes people try to get him to do stuff, like reinstate the oracle's apocalyptic prophecies, or punish someone with a plague, or at least pose dramatically. He refuses with a grin and a shrug. Occasionally, he'll offer a cryptic haiku instead. Someone once demanded to know if their crops would fail that season. Apollo replied, "Rain speaks in riddles. Trust the silence of the dirt. Eat more pears." Oddly enough, the guy left happy, which brings us to the tourists from Thrace incident. A noble family from Thrace arrives expecting fireworks and revelations. What they find is a barefoot god meditating beside a turtle. Is this part of the show, one whispers? The youngest daughter is fascinated. She asks Apollo what he's doing. He says trying not to be a god right now. She sits beside him. The rest of the family leaves confused. She stays a week, learns to bake olive bread, names the turtle Aristotle, refuses to go back to court life. Apollo gives her a lyre and a goat, a normal Wednesday in Delphi. Some skeptics argue this whole Quiet Apollo era was a public relations move, soft rebranding for a sun god, with too many historical meltdowns. But anyone who's been here knows better. This isn't image control. This is emotional exhalation. It's a god relearning the art of not needing to impress anyone. He still writes music, by the way. But now it's the sort of music that feels like warm grass and the distant clink of amphora lids. You don't dance to it. You breathe to it. And on rare evenings, he plays it just for the goats. They seem to like it. A lot of people show up expecting answers. They leave with better questions. Like, what if success wasn't the goal? Or who am I when I'm not performing? Or even, is it okay that I forgot how to dream for a while? Apollo never answers outright. Instead, he hands them something simple. A plum, a line of verse, a blanket. Because here, comfort is revelation. And here's a delightful quirk for you. One of the temple cats starts attending quiet hours. She naps on the altar, absolutely unbothered. Someone names her Hush. Apollo says she's the new oracle. She meows once, and everyone goes silent. 10 minutes later, a man stands up, declares he's going to quit politics and open a fig stand. Nobody argues. You begin to realize the myth is no longer about what happened, but about the space between events. The lull, the breath, the small but holy luxury of enough. And sometimes when the sunset spills gold across the stones and the whole temple smells like time and dust and distant bread, Apollo looks at you, yes you, and nods, as if to say this matters too. Not the triumph, not the tragedy, the pause between, the part where you let go. The temple gains a rhythm as all quiet places do. You now know the sound of wind through old laurel trees, the way the goats grumble before breakfast, the creak of sandals on ancient stone, slow and unhurried. You even know which acolyte snores during afternoon meditations. It's Thales. His snores sound like philosophical distress. And Apollo, he whistles now. Not a grand orchestral fanfare, just simple little tunes that catch on the breeze and nestle into the rafters. You hear one and instantly crave honey cake. The power of divine suggestion is real. One morning, a stranger arrives with scrolls, dusty, curled at the edges, held together with faded ribbon. She's an archivist from Corinth. Quiet eyes, permanent ink on her fingers. Says she's collecting alternate versions of Apollo's stories, the forgotten ones, not the ones where he slays or blinds or turns people into plants. She wants the soft tales, the maybe they happened, maybe they didn't ones. Stories of Apollo braiding his sister's hair, of teaching mortals to whistle, of borrowing sandals from Hermes and never giving them back. Historians still argue whether these stories were oral traditions lost over time or inventions by later poets trying to soften a harsh god's image. But you know better. Some truths live in quiet spaces. You help the archivist sort her scrolls. She tells you one in hushed tones, an odd little tale about the time Apollo disguised himself as a fisherman to escape his duties. He spent 2 months in a coastal village mending nets badly and flirting terribly with the fishmonger's daughter. He left behind a lyre carved with seashells. No one believed her, but every full moon the waves hum. In Delphi, no one questions this kind of story anymore. They just add it to the collection. One acolyte starts illustrating them crudely lovingly in the margins of old hymns. Another sets them to music. Soon there's an unofficial scroll called Apollo but Make It Relatable, circulating among the temple youth. It's wildly popular. You overhear 2 scribes arguing whether Apollo once got stage fright at his own festival. He did. He tripped over a lyre string, landed in a fig tart, and made it look intentional. Everyone clapped. He blushed anyway. In a way, that moment marked the beginning of what people now call the mortal period. Not because Apollo stopped being divine, but because he finally admitted that divinity didn't mean distance. Sometimes immortality just means having time to get bored. And boredom, weirdly, has made him kinder, more available. He still has flashes of godness. Like the time he stared at a cracked amphora for 5 hours and made the olives inside spontaneously ferment into the best tapenade anyone had ever tasted. Or when he whistled a thunderstorm away, just because someone's laundry was still drying. But mostly he just listens, and sometimes that's the miracle. The archivist leaves after a week, promising to come back with more stories. She gives Apollo a scroll titled "The Time You Helped a Mortal Without Turning Them into a Plant." He chuckles. It's a short scroll, she says, but growing, he replies. And yes, she blushes. A bard in training writes a song about that moment. It rhymes scroll with soul. Everyone groans, then sings it anyway. You start to realize something about Delphi. It's not just a sanctuary now. It's an emotional compost heap. People come here full of noise, worries, regrets, weird dreams where they accidentally marry a sphinx and they leave quieter, not always healed, but more rooted, less on fire. There's even a garden now, a real one. Apollo plants things that don't bloom quickly. Lavender, fennel, patience. And every time someone asks If they'll get what they came here for, he says the same thing. Maybe not today. The temple gets a guest from Sparta, tough-scarred, no nonsense. She's expecting prophecy. She gets poetry. She's not thrilled until she sits under the fig tree, watches the chickens, and hears the wind in the pine. She leaves with a sketch of Apollo laughing drawn in charcoal. Says it's the first thing she's drawn in 20 years. Maybe not today, but something shifted. Even the oracle gets in on it now. No more cryptic riddles about blood and doom. These days she answers questions with more questions. Will I succeed in my journey? Someone asks. The oracle smiles. Is it your journey yet? Will my crops survive the season? Have you listened to them lately? Will my love return? Do you need them to? And instead of frustration, people leave, blinking, softened, like they've walked through mist and emerged a little less tangled. Because sometimes the question is the answer, and in Delphi Apollo knows that now. He walks through the garden with his sandals untied, hums with his mouth full of fig, leans into imperfections the way vines lean into sun-warmed walls. And when he catches your eye, he gives the faintest nod, as if to say you're growing too. You wake to the sound of bees, not the angry apocalyptic kind, just the lazy summer buzz of contented insects, drifting between thyme blossoms and overripe figs. The temple breathes in time with them. Even the columns seem sleepier, as if they too have found peace in peeling paint and ivy. Apollo, barefoot as always, is trying to convince a rooster to stop yelling at sunrise. We get it, he says, holding a single olive out like a peace offering. The sun's up. That's literally my job. The rooster, unmoved, screams. Apollo sighs and tosses the olive to a nearby cat. The cat presumably hush-bats it twice and curls up again. You settle beside a fig tree where an old poet is teaching 3 children how to find rhythm in silence. He claps once, pauses. The children mimic him. It's like watching ripples echo in a still pond. There's no curriculum, no divine syllabus, just breath and time and the quiet courage of not knowing what comes next. Later, a merchant from Thebes stumbles into the garden, holding a scroll that reads, "Urgent need clarity about my father's inheritance and possible cursed amphora." Apollo reads it, nods solemnly, and then says, "Do you want tea or wine while we talk about this?" The merchant blinks. Tea. The answer, it turns out, is that the amphora is not cursed, just full of very old garlic. The inheritance is still messy, the father emotionally constipated. But the merchant leaves with 3 figs, a recipe for soup, and a growing suspicion that perhaps what he really needed was not clarity but community. Historians still argue whether this transformation of Delphi from a prophecy hotspot to a therapeutic retreat was driven by Apollo's own disillusionment or a broader cultural shift among disenchanted mortals. But again, you're living it. You know it wasn't strategy, it was surrender, and maybe a bit of stubborn compassion. At lunch, the oracle tells a joke involving a satyr, a barrel of olives, and a misinterpreted love spell. You don't catch all the details, but the punchline makes Apollo snort wine out of his nose. The oracle high-fives a chicken. Moments like this shouldn't be divine, but somehow they are. And speaking of the divine, the gods do notice Apollo's sabbatical. Some approve. Demeter sends seeds. Dionysus gifts a particularly mischievous vine that's now attempting to scale the temple roof. Artemis visits briefly, challenges Apollo to a foot race, and leaves a note that just says, "Keep the weird." I like it. Others aren't so impressed. A pigeon arrives from Olympus carrying a passive-aggressive letter from Zeus. Something about neglecting duty's erosion of mythic potency and mandatory quarterly thunderbolt reviews. Apollo feeds the pigeon a cracker and files the scroll under noise. You're pretty sure he's never going back. The next day, an elderly couple arrives. They've walked for weeks to see the god of music, healing, and light. Not because they need anything, just to say thanks. Thanks for the warmth, the old man says, gripping Apollo's hand. You shine softer now. That evening, Apollo sits on the steps watching the sun dip behind the hills. Did I ever tell you? He murmurs that once I tried to light a whole kingdom on fire just to make them notice me. You nod. You've heard whispers. That particular story doesn't end well. And now, he says, plucking a fig, I get noticed for not doing anything at all. He doesn't say it with pride. He says it with wonder. A goat leans against his leg. You lean back and let your shoulders soften. You remember when this place felt like it might fall apart from the weight of its own expectations. Now it's a slow-breathing creature, a temple less of marble than of pause. And sometimes that's what a god needs. What you need. At dusk there's a ritual, but it's not for Apollo. It's for stillness. No chanting, no fire, just everyone standing in the garden. As the last of the light fades and the crickets take over the night shift, you feel the hush in your ribs. You think this might be my favorite part? Someone plays a single note on the lyre. Someone else laughs softly. You fall asleep on the stone steps, head tilted toward the stars. Apollo covers you with a blanket and says nothing. Somewhere nearby, the rooster is finally silent. You don't wake up to a dramatic sunrise, a holy pronouncement, or an epic new quest. You wake up because someone is singing to a goat. It's a soft, off-key lullaby, probably improvised, and the goat seems to be tolerating it only because breakfast appears imminent. You sit up, blink at the morning light, spilling through olive branches, and notice Apollo lounging under a cypress tree with one sandal off, humming along. Morning, he says, like he's not a millennia-old deity whose temper once scorched armies. Like he's just your neighbor with really great hair and a persistent glow. You stretch, yawn, and reach for a fig. The oracle is watering herbs. Someone's repairing a bench using more twine than wood. A pair of young acolytes are deep in an argument over whether or not Apollo's latest song is about divine longing or just a particularly good piece of cheese. Delphi at this point has no beginning or end to the day. It just flows, like warm honey down marble steps. And then the letter arrives, hand-delivered by a satyr wearing aviator shades. No one asks. The letter itself is sealed in gold wax, embossed with the unmistakable sigil of Mount Olympus Thunderbolt Laurel Wreath, General Flare. Apollo reads it. His expression shifts slightly, something between bemusement and mild eye roll. They're sending someone, he says. Who's they, you ask, though, you know? Olympus, Review Committee, Divine HR, whatever they're calling themselves this decade. You raise an eyebrow. You're getting a performance review. He shrugs. Guess even gods get audited. Historians still argue whether the so-called Olympian intervention was an attempt to reinstate divine order or simply a late-stage reaction to Apollo's growing mortal fan base. Either way, 3 days later she arrives, Hera, queen of the gods, matron of marriage majesty, and impressively arched brows. She descends into Delphi, not with thunder, but with elegance wrapped in peacock-colored silk, her eyes assessing everything like a museum curator who's just been handed a macaroni sculpture by a very earnest child. She surveys the fig trees, the slightly lopsided altar, the chickens. She watches as Apollo offers a child a panpipe made from a hollow reed. She watches him laugh when the reed squeaks unexpectedly. She doesn't smile. She sits, and you brace yourself for divine scolding. Instead, she says, Explain the goat. Apollo gestures broadly, therapy animal. Hera raises an eyebrow. He shrugs, mostly for me. Silence. The wind stirs her robes. Then she says something no one expects. I want tea. The temple scrambles. Teacups are found. Cushions are fluffed. Even the fig tree seems to try harder. And somehow you find yourself sitting cross-legged across from the Queen of Olympus, watching her sip mint tea while Apollo hums under his breath and a cat naps on a hymnal. What is this place? Hera asks finally. Delphi has been many things, so the question is harder than it sounds. Apollo says nothing. He simply holds out his hand. A child takes it. A priestess kneels to pet the goat. A traveler offers up a jar of jam. Is this worship? Hera asks. No, Apollo says. It's being. She nods once, slowly. Zeus thinks you've forgotten your place. Apollo smiles, and there's an ancient sadness there. But also peace. Maybe I've found it. More silence. This time, not heavy, just full. The rooster tries to crow, changes its mind. Hera sets her teacup down and stands. I'll tell them you're still divine, she says. But in a quieter way. He nods, and she's gone. Just like that. You let out a breath you didn't realize you were holding. The entire temple does. And in that moment, it becomes official. Delphi is safe. Not just protected, but understood. No one's getting fired. No thunderbolts on the horizon. No return to old scripts. Later that evening, Apollo writes a new song. It's short. It doesn't rhyme. But it feels like the beginning of something. It's played on a flute carved by a farmer, sung by a child who forgets half the words. Accompanied by a wind chime someone made from spoons. And it's perfect. The stars come out in no particular order. You lie back on warm stone and watch them blink a little out of sync like sleepy eyes. Tomorrow you'll leave. You'll go back to wherever you came from, bringing with you nothing but a few crumbs of fig cake and the memory of a god who once got fired from a cow job and accidentally changed the world by doing less. You'll remember the whisper of time underfoot, the lazy arc of sunbeams through the olive trees, the warm hum of belonging, and maybe you'll plant something, not because you need it to bloom fast, but because it might surprise you someday. Maybe not today, but eventually. Wind down 300 words. So now, as the last of the stars scatter gently across the velvet sky, you feel your breath slowing. The temple is quiet again, humming softly with nighttime things. The creak of old stone cooling down, the faint cluck of a drowsy chicken. The distant strum of a lyre played not for applause, but simply because it feels good in the hands. You let your shoulders sink, let your thoughts loosen like sandals slipping off after a long walk. The air carries a cool sweetness, now mint and fig, and the distant trace of sun-warmed laurel. Apollo isn't singing anymore. He's just sitting beside you, eyes half closed, face lit with starlight. You don't need to speak. Some silences are complete. Around you the quiet rustle of dreams. And in your heart, a strange new ease. No great prophecy, no dazzling firework of revelation, just the quiet comfort of having seen a god grow tired and choose gentleness. You're safe here, for now, for always. So close your eyes. Let the garden fade behind your lids. Let the last notes of Apollo's lullaby drift far, far away and slip softly into sleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.